For this video, what I want to do is I want to show you how to use the cosine sum and difference identities in order to find exact values using the unit circle. So first you need to know the sum identity for cosine is cosine of any two angles, like if I have the sum of two angles, is equal to cosine of the first angle times cosine of the second angle minus sine of the first angle times sine of the second angle. So A and B just represent any two angles that you're talking about. The difference formula says that cosine of the first angle minus the second angle is equal to cosine of the first times cosine of the second plus sine of the first sine of the second. Make sure you watch for the fact that when it's addition, when you're putting your cosine and sines together, that it's subtraction, so they're always the opposite sign. All right, so the first thing that we want to do is we want to use these rules to help us find cosine 75. Cosine 75 is not on the unit circle. So what I want to do is find two values on the unit circle that would either give me a sum of 75 or a difference of 75. So you may see a couple things that would work. For me, what I'm going to use is I'm going to use 30 plus 45. Okay, so 30 plus 45 gives me 75. So I'm going to rewrite this as cosine 30 plus 45. So I haven't changed anything, I just rewrote 75 in a different form. Remember that when you're talking about the unit circle, that the ordered pairs are always in the form cosine comma sine. So we can use that fact along with this rule to help us find cosine 75. So since we have the sum of two angles, we would rewrite this as cosine of 30 times cosine of 45. And because we do the opposite, we would do minus sine of 30 times the sine of 45 degrees. Okay, now I can just go to my unit circle and find these values. So remember that it's cosine comma sine, so I'm going to use these two right here. Okay, the cosine of 30 degrees is the first one, the square root 3 over 2. Okay, times cosine of 45 is the square root of 2 over 2. And then we would subtract from it the sine of 30, which is 1/2, times the sine of 45 degrees, which also happens to be the same thing, square root 2 over 2, as the cosine of 45. Okay, now if we just simplify, all we have to do is multiply. Remember that with radicals, you multiply what's underneath. So square root of 3 times square root of 2 gives me square root of 6. Both of these are going to have a denominator of 4, so I'm just going to write it all over 4. Negative 1 times square root of 2 just gives me the negative square root of 2, and that would be my final answer. So the exact value of cosine 75 is the square root of 6 minus square root of 2 divided by 4. You could check this in your calculator by plugging cosine 75 degrees in, and you could also plug this whole thing into your calculator and see if they're equivalent expressions. All right, so now let's look at the second one. The second one that we have is a little bit harder to see because it's in radians and you have to find fractions that add or subtract up to be 17 pi over 12. So the one that I chose to do is 27 pi over 12 minus 10 pi over 12 ends up giving me 17 pi over 12, and then I would just reduce both of these because I can't find those values on my unit circle. So if I reduce this, this reduces to 9 pi. Let me write the cosine first. So I would have cosine 9 pi over 4, and the 10/12 reduces to 5 over 6 minus 5 pi over 6. And I know you might be thinking that 9 pi over 4 does not show up on here, but the thing with 9 pi over 4, when I'm thinking about this angle right here, 9 pi over 4 would simplify into 2 1/4 pi, or we could think about it as 2 pi over, I don't know the easiest way to write that to make it make sense. Okay, so 2 1/4 pi is probably the easiest way to think of that, which 2 pi means that we went one full rotation, plus we went 1/4 more, so we're going to end up here at this point. Okay, so now what we can do is we can use this point for pi over 4, and we can use 5 pi over 6 as our second point. So when I rewrite this, we always start with cosine. So I would have cosine 9 pi over 4 times cosine 5 pi over 6. And remember that we always do the opposite. So since it's minus here, since we're using the difference, we're going to put it as plus sine 9 pi over 4 times sine 5 pi over 6. So now we would just go to our unit circle, and we would see that 9 pi over 4, remember we already talked about, gets us back to this point, is square root 2 over 2. Okay, cosine 5 pi over 6, since we're talking about the x coordinate, is negative square root 3 over 2. Plus sine is square root 2 over 2. Times the sine of 5 pi over 6 is 1/2. So if I simplify this, we would end up with negative square root of 6, because again we're multiplying 2 times 3. Under the radical you can multiply together. Numbers on the outside get multiplied together. Okay, both of these again are going to be over 4, because 2 times 2 is 4, 2 times 2 is 4, so I can just write it as one fraction. And so then I would have plus square root of 2. If you don't like the minus being at the front, you could always switch this to to square root of 2 minus square root of 6 over 4, but either way works. As always, thanks for watching. If you have any questions, please let me know. If there are additional topics you need me to cover, please let me know that as well. And I would really appreciate it if you would consider subscribing.